A young homeless man dares to order food at an upscale restaurant, and what happens leaves him open-mouthed. The neon lights of Elmsbrook's bustling downtown district flickered to life as dusk settled over the city. Amidst the gleaming skyscrapers and trendy boutiques, a solitary figure shuffled along the sidewalk, his threadbare clothes a stark contrast to the polished storefronts surrounding him. Zeke Holloway, barely 16 years old, had long since lost count of the days he'd spent on the streets. His stomach growled relentlessly, a painful reminder that he hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. The enticing aromas wafting from nearby restaurants only intensified his hunger, each whiff a cruel taunt to his empty belly. As he trudged along, his gaze fell upon an ornate sign that read Chateau Lumière. The restaurant's exterior exuded an air of opulence, with its gleaming windows and meticulously manicured topiaries flanking the entrance. Zeke hesitated, knowing full well that such an establishment was far beyond his means. But desperation clouded his judgment, and before he could reconsider, his feet carried him towards the gilded double doors. The maître d', a tall man with a perfectly waxed mustache, regarded Zeke with barely concealed disdain as he stepped into the lavish foyer. "May I help you?" he asked, his tone clipped and cold. Zeke swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how out of place he must look. I was wondering if you had any leftovers," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or maybe some work I could do in exchange for a meal." The maître d's expression hardened. "This is not a soup kitchen, young man. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Zeke's shoulders slumped in defeat, but as he turned to go, a commotion from the kitchen caught his attention. A tall, distinguished-looking man in an impeccably tailored suit burst through the swinging doors, his face flushed with anger. "Harrison!" the man bellowed, addressing the maître d'. "What's the meaning of this? Why isn't Table 7's order ready yet?" As the man's gaze swept the foyer, his eyes locked with Zeke's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Something flickered in the man's expression. Recognition, perhaps? Or was it compassion? "And who might this young man be?" the suited man asked, his tone softening as he approached Zeke. Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "No one of consequence, Mr. Blackwood. I was just showing him out." But Callum Blackwood, owner of Chateau Lumière and several other upscale restaurants throughout Elmsbrook, held up a hand to silence his employee. He studied Zeke intently, taking in the boy's gaunt features and ragged appearance. "What's your name, son?" Callum asked gently. Zeke hesitated, unused to such kindness from strangers. "Zeke," he replied cautiously. "Zeke Holloway." Callum nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Zeke Holloway, how would you like to join me for dinner?" Harrison's jaw dropped in shock, but Callum paid him no mind. He placed a hand on Zeke's shoulder, guiding him towards a private dining room at the back of the restaurant. As they walked, Zeke couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. Little did he know just how right he was. The private dining room was a stark contrast to the world Zeke had known for so long. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the polished mahogany table, while plush velvet chairs invited comfort he hadn't experienced in years. Zeke perched awkwardly on the edge of his seat, acutely aware of the grime on his hands and the holes in his shoes. Callum Blackwood sat across from him, his piercing blue eyes studying Zeke with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Order anything you'd like," he said, gesturing to the leather-bound menu. "It's on the house." Zeke's hands trembled as he opened the menu, the unfamiliar words swimming before his eyes. Sensing his discomfort, Callum gently took the menu from him. "How about I order for both of us?" he suggested. "I think I know just the thing." As they waited for their food, Callum leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "So, Zeke," he began, his voice kind but firm, "how long have you been on the streets?" Zeke shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the pristine tablecloth. "A few years, I guess," he mumbled. "Since the foster home. Well, it doesn't matter now." Callum nodded, a flicker of understanding passing across his features. "And your parents?" "Never knew 'em," Zeke replied, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. "Been bouncing around the system since I was a baby." Before Callum could respond, a waiter appeared with their first course, a steaming bowl of French onion soup, its rich aroma making Zeke's mouth water. He watched in fascination as Callum demonstrated how to break through the melted cheese crust, then mimicked the action with his own spoon. As they ate, Callum shared stories of his own childhood, tales of growing up in Elmsbrook's wealthiest neighborhood, of summers spent sailing on Lake Crystalline, and of the expectations that came with being born into privilege. Zeke listened intently, trying to imagine a world so different from his own. It wasn't until their main course arrived, a perfectly seared filet mignon with truffle mashed potatoes, that Callum dropped the bombshell that would change everything. "You know, Zeke," he said, cutting into his steak with practiced ease, "I wasn't always the man you see before you today." Zeke paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean?" Callum set down his utensils, his expression growing serious. "When I was about your age, I was living on these very streets, hungry, scared, and alone, just like you." Zeke's eyes widened in disbelief. "But how?" "It's a long story," Callum said with a sad smile, "one I don't often share, but the short version is this. I was a runaway, convinced I could make it on my own. It didn't take long for reality to set in, and I found myself in a situation very similar to yours." He paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. "One night I stumbled into a restaurant not unlike this one, begging for scraps. The owner, a kind-hearted woman named Evelyn Chambers, took pity on me. She didn't just feed me, she gave me a job, a place to stay, and eventually a family." Zeke listened, spellbound, as Callum recounted how Evelyn and her husband, unable to have children of their own, had legally adopted him. How they had nurtured his passion for cooking, sent him to culinary school, and helped him open his first restaurant. "Evelyn passed away last year," Callum said, his voice thick with emotion. "Her final wish was for me to continue her legacy of kindness, to pay forward the gift she gave me all those years ago." He reached across the table, placing a hand on Zeke's arm. "Which brings me to why I brought you in here tonight, Zeke. I'd like to help you if you'll let me. Not just with a meal or some new clothes, but with a real chance at a better life." Zeke's heart raced, hope and suspicion warring within him. He'd learned the hard way not to trust easily, but something about Callum's sincerity made him want to believe. "Why?" Zeke asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do that for me?" Callum's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Because someone once did it for me," he replied simply, "and because every child deserves a chance to thrive, not just survive." As the weight of Callum's words sank in, Zeke felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a flicker of hope for the future. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would transform not only his life, but the lives of everyone around him. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind for Zeke. True to his word, Callum Blackwood had taken the young man under his wing, setting in motion a series of events that would forever alter the course of Zeke's life. The first order of business had been a thorough medical examination. Dr. Amelia Forrester, a kind-faced woman with salt and pepper hair, had tutted sympathetically as she assessed Zeke's condition. Years of malnutrition and exposure to the elements had taken their toll, but with proper care and treatment, she assured them both that Zeke would make a full recovery. "It'll take time," Dr. Forrester had explained, scribbling notes on her clipboard. "But with a balanced diet, regular checkups, and plenty of rest, we'll have you fighting fit in no time, young man." Zeke had nodded numbly, still struggling to process the rapid changes in his circumstances. It wasn't until he caught sight of his reflection in the clinic's bathroom mirror that the reality of his situation truly sank in. Gone were the matted dreads and dirt-streaked face. In their place was a clean-shaven young man with neatly trimmed hair, wearing clothes that actually fit. For the first time in years, Zeke recognized himself. As they left the clinic, Callum had placed a gentle hand on Zeke's shoulder. "There's something important we need to discuss," he'd said, his tone serious. "I meant what I said about giving you a real chance, Zeke. If you're willing, I'd like to begin the process of legally adopting you." Zeke had frozen in his tracks, his mind reeling. "Adopt me?" he'd stammered. "But why? You barely know me." Callum's eyes had crinkled with warmth. "Sometimes, Zeke, you just know when something is right. I see so much potential in you, potential that deserves to be nurtured. And more than that, I see a young man who deserves a family, a home, and a future. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to provide all of that." Tears had welled up in Zeke's eyes. years of pent-up emotion finally breaking through. Without a word, he'd thrown his arms around Callum, clinging to him as if his life depended on it. In that moment, a bond was forged that would withstand any challenge life could throw their way. The legal process of adoption was complex and time-consuming, but Callum approached it with the same determination he applied to all aspects of his life. Social workers visited their home, a spacious penthouse apartment overlooking Elmsbrook's picturesque harbour, conducting interviews and assessing Zeke's living conditions. Throughout it all, Callum remained a steady presence, guiding Zeke through the unfamiliar terrain of his new life. He enrolled Zeke in online classes to help him catch up on the education he'd missed, hired tutors to work with him one-on-one, and even began teaching him the basics of running a restaurant. "You've got a good head for business," Callum remarked one evening as they pored over the books for Chateau Lumière. "Who knows, maybe someday you'll be running this place." Zeke had ducked his head, a pleased flush coloring his cheeks. The idea of having a future, let alone one filled with such possibility, was still foreign to him. But with each passing day, he found himself daring to dream just a little bit bigger. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. Zeke struggled with nightmares, vivid dreams of being cast back out onto the streets or of Callum changing his mind. On those nights, he'd wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings of his new bedroom. But Callum was always there, ready with a cup of hot cocoa and a listening ear. They'd sit on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below, as Zeke slowly calmed down. "I know it's hard to believe," Callum would say, his voice gentle but firm. "But you're home now, Zeke. This is where you belong, and nothing is going to change that, I promise." As spring turned to summer, Zeke found himself settling into a routine he'd never dreamed possible. Mornings were spent studying, afternoons working alongside Callum at the restaurant, and evenings filled with laughter and conversation over home-cooked meals. It was during one of these evening meals that Callum broached a subject that would usher in the next chapter of Zeke's transformation. "I've been thinking," Callum began, setting down his fork. "My sister Olivia and her husband are planning to send their kids here for the summer. I thought it might be nice for you to have some company your own age." Zeke's stomach clenched with anxiety. He'd grown comfortable with Callum, but the idea of meeting new people, especially ones connected to his new family, filled him with dread. Sensing his unease, Callum reached across the table, squeezing Zeke's hand reassuringly. "They're good kids, Zeke. Olivia's told them all about you and they're excited to meet their new cousin. But if you're not ready, we can always—" "No," Zeke interrupted, surprising himself with his own determination. "No, I think I'd like that. To meet them, I mean." Callum's face split into a wide grin. "That's my boy," he said proudly. "They'll be here next week. We'll make it a proper welcome, maybe even have a barbecue down by Lake Crystalline. What do you say?" As Zeke nodded his agreement, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and trepidation. This would be his first real test, a chance to see if he could truly fit into this new world Callum had opened up for him. Little did he know, the arrival of his cousins would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about family, loyalty, and his place in the world. The day of the cousins' arrival dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect summer morning that seemed to exist only in movies. Zeke stood nervously in front of the floor-length mirror in his bedroom, fidgeting with the collar of his new polo shirt. He barely recognized the boy staring back at him. Gone was the gaunt, haunted look that had been his constant companion for so long. In its place was a young man with clear skin, bright eyes, and the beginnings of a healthy glow. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his reverie. "You ready, kiddo?" Callum asked, poking his head into the room. "They'll be here any minute." Zeke took a deep breath, smoothing down his shirt one last time. "As ready as I'll ever be, I guess." Callum crossed the room, placing both hands on Zeke's shoulders and meeting his eyes in the mirror. "You've got nothing to worry about," he said reassuringly. "Just be yourself. They're going to love you." Before Zeke could respond, the chime of the doorbell echoed through the apartment. This was it, the moment of truth. As they made their way to the foyer, Zeke's heart pounded so loudly he was sure Callum must be able to hear it. The door swung open, revealing a whirlwind of activity and noise. "Uncle Cal!" a voice squealed, and suddenly a blur of red hair and freckles barreled past Zeke, launching itself at Callum. Laughing, Callum scooped up the young girl, spinning her around. "There's my Rosie Posy," he exclaimed. "My goodness, you've grown." Two more figures appeared in the doorway, a lanky boy with shaggy blonde hair who looked to be about Zeke's age, and a slightly younger girl with long, dark braids and glasses. "Hey, Uncle Cal," the boy said, grinning as he stepped inside. His eyes flickered to Zeke, curiosity evident in his expression. "You must be Zeke. I'm Tyler." Zeke managed a small smile, relief washing over him at Tyler's friendly demeanor. "Nice to meet you," he replied, his voice only slightly shaky. The dark-haired girl stepped forward, adjusting her glasses as she offered Zeke a shy smile. "I'm Mia," she said softly. "It's really cool to meet you. Uncle Cal's told us so much about you." Zeke felt a warmth spreading through his chest at their easy acceptance. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Callum set Rosie down, the little girl immediately latching onto his leg. "Well, now that introductions are out of the way, who's hungry? I thought we might head down to Lake Crystalline for a picnic lunch." A chorus of excited cheers met this suggestion, and soon they were piling into Callum's SUV, coolers and picnic baskets in tow. As they drove through the winding streets of Elmsbrook, Zeke found himself relaxing, drawn into animated conversations about the cousins' journey from their home in Oak Ridge, a small town about 3 hours away. Lake Crystalline lived up to its name, its azure waters sparkling in the midday sun. Callum led them to a secluded spot beneath a cluster of weeping willows, their long branches providing welcome shade from the summer heat. As they spread out blankets and unpacked the food, Zeke couldn't help but marvel at the easy camaraderie between Callum and his nieces and nephew. It was clear that despite the distance, they were close-knit, years of shared memories and inside jokes evident in their interactions. "So Zeke," Tyler said as they dug into sandwiches and fresh fruit, "Uncle Cal says you've been helping out at the restaurant. That must be pretty cool." Zeke nodded, swallowing a bite of his turkey club. "Yeah, it's been amazing. I never thought I'd enjoy cooking so much, but Callum's been teaching me all sorts of techniques." Mia's eyes lit up. "Oh, do you think you could teach me some? I've always wanted to learn how to make those fancy desserts like they have at Chateau Lumière." "I'd be happy to show you," Zeke replied, surprised by his own enthusiasm. "Maybe we could try making something together while you're here." As the afternoon wore on, Zeke found himself opening up more and more. He shared stories of his first disastrous attempts at making hollandaise sauce, laughed at Tyler's impression of their stern-faced math teacher back in Oak Ridge, and even joined in a splash war when they all decided to cool off in the lake. It wasn't until the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in vivid shades of orange and pink, that Callum suggested they pack up and head home. As they gathered their things, Rosie tugged on Zeke's hand, her green eyes wide and serious. "Zeke?" she asked, her voice small. "Are you really our cousin now?" Zeke felt a lump form in his throat. He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the little girl. "I guess I am," he said softly. Is that okay with you?" Rosie's face broke into a wide grin. "It's the best," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around his neck. "I always wanted a big cousin to play with." As Zeke hugged her back, he caught Callum's eye over Rosie's shoulder. The older man was watching them, a look of pure joy and pride on his face. In that moment, Zeke felt a sense of belonging he'd never experienced before. The drive home was filled with chatter about plans for the rest of the summer, trips to the local water park, movie nights, and promises of culinary adventures in Callum's state-of-the-art kitchen. Zeke found himself eagerly joining in, the last of his reservations melting away in the face of his newfound family's warmth. As they pulled into the underground parking garage of Callum's building, Tyler nudged Zeke with his elbow. "Hey," he said, his voice low, "I just wanted to say I'm really glad you're part of the family now. It's nice having another guy around to balance out all this girl power." He jerked his thumb towards Mia and Rosie, who were engaged in an animated debate about which flavor of ice cream was superior. Zeke felt a grin spreading across his face. "Thanks, man," he replied. "I'm glad too." As they rode the elevator up to the penthouse, Zeke couldn't help but marvel at how much his life had changed in such a short time. Just months ago, he'd been alone and hopeless, scavenging for his next meal. Now he was surrounded by people who genuinely seemed to care about him, who accepted him without question. But as the elevator doors slid open and they spilled out into the hallway, a tiny seed of doubt wormed its way into Zeke's mind. Could this really last? Was he truly worthy of all this love and acceptance, or was it all just a beautiful dream from which he'd eventually have to wake up? Little did Zeke know, these doubts would soon be put to the test in ways he could never have imagined. The idyllic summer days stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. But beneath the surface, forces were at work that would challenge the bonds of their newfound family and force Zeke to confront the demons of his past once and for all. As July melted into August, life in the Blackwood household settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were spent exploring Elmsbrook's many attractions, from the bustling farmers' market to the interactive exhibits at the Science Centre. Afternoons often found them at Chateau Lumière, where Zeke proudly showed his cousins the ins and outs of a professional kitchen. It was during one of these afternoons that the first ripple of unease disturbed the peaceful waters of Zeke's new life. He was in the middle of demonstrating how to properly julienne vegetables when a commotion near the restaurant's entrance caught his attention. "I'm telling you, I saw him," a shrill voice insisted. "That's the kid who's been hanging around 43rd Street begging for change. What's he doing back here in the kitchen?" Zeke's knife clattered to the cutting board, his face draining of color. He recognized that voice. It belonged to Mrs. Harrington, a regular customer known for her exacting standards and propensity for gossip. Before he could react, Callum materialized at his side, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "Is there a problem here, Mrs. Harrington?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of steel beneath the politeness. The woman's eyes darted between Callum and Zeke, confusion evident on her heavily made-up face. "Mr. Blackwood, surely you can't mean to tell me that this street urchin is allowed in your kitchen? Think of the health code violations." Zeke felt his chest tighten, shame and anger warring within him. But before he could say anything, Callum stepped forward, drawing himself up to his full height. "Mrs. Harrington," he began, his tone icy, "I would thank you not to speak about my son in such a manner. Zeke is a valued member of both this restaurant's staff and my family. If you have concerns about our adherence to health codes, I'd be happy to show you our most recent inspection results. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." A hush fell over the kitchen as Mrs. Harrington sputtered indignantly. "Well, I never!" she exclaimed. "You can be certain I won't be dining here again, Mr. Blackwood. And I'll be sure to let all my friends know about this travesty." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out, the sound of her stilettos echoing through the suddenly silent restaurant. Callum turned to Zeke, his expression softening. "You okay, kiddo?" Zeke nodded numbly, overwhelmed by the mix of emotions coursing through him. On one hand, he was deeply touched by Callum's unwavering support, but on the other, Mrs. Harrington's words had brought his past crashing back into the present, reminding him of the vast gulf between the life he'd known and the one he now lived. That night, as the cousins settled in for a movie marathon, Zeke found himself unable to focus on the screen. His mind kept replaying the scene at the restaurant, Mrs. Harrington's words echoing in his ears. He must have been more obvious in his distraction than he thought, because halfway through the second film, Tyler paused the movie and turned to him. "All right, spill," he said. "What's eating you?" Mia and Rosie looked over curiously, and Zeke felt a sudden urge to unburden himself. Taking a deep breath, he recounted the incident at the restaurant. I don't know," he finished, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "What if she's right? What if I don't belong here? What if I'm just kidding myself thinking I can be part of this world?" A moment of silence followed his outburst. Then, to his surprise, Mia let out a snort of laughter. "Are you kidding me?" she asked, shaking her head. "Zeke, do you have any idea how boring our summers used to be before you came along? All we ever did was hang around the house and complain about being hot. Now look at us. We're learning to cook gourmet meals, exploring the city, actually having fun." Tyler nodded in agreement. "Plus, have you seen the way Uncle Cal looks at you? I've never seen him so happy. You're not just some charity case to him, Zeke. You're family." "Yeah," Rosie chimed in, her little face serious. "And family means nobody gets left behind or forgotten." "That's from Lilo and Stitch. It's my favorite movie." Zeke felt a lump form in his throat, touched beyond words by their unwavering support. "Thanks, guys," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I guess I'm not used to all this, you know. Sometimes it feels too good to be true." Mia reached out, squeezing his hand. "Well, get used to it," she said firmly, "because we're not going anywhere and neither are you." As they unpaused the movie and settled back into their blanket fort, Zeke felt a warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time in his life, he truly understood what it meant to have a family, people who would stand by you no matter what. But even as he basked in the glow of their acceptance, a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered that it couldn't last, that sooner or later his past would catch up with him and shatter this fragile happiness he'd found. Little did he know that moment would come sooner than he could have ever imagined. The next morning dawned bright and clear, promising another perfect summer day. As Zeke stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes, he found Callum already there, a serious expression on his face. "Zeke," he said, his voice grave, "there's something we need to discuss." Zeke's heart plummeted. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading. Callum had finally come to his senses and realized what a mistake he'd made in taking in a street kid. But as Callum gestured for him to sit, the older man's next words were the last thing Zeke expected to hear. "I've been contacted by a woman named Clara Holloway," Callum began, watching Zeke's face carefully. "She claims to be your biological mother." The world seemed to tilt on its axis, everything Zeke thought he knew crumbling around him. As he struggled to process this bombshell, one thought echoed through his mind. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days following Callum's revelation passed in a blur for Zeke. Clara Holloway, the woman who claimed to be his mother, had reached out through a private investigator she'd hired to track down the son she'd given up for adoption 16 years ago. According to the story she'd told Callum, Clara had been barely more than a child herself when she'd given birth to Zeke. Overwhelmed and unable to care for an infant, she'd made the heartbreaking decision to place him for adoption. But as the years passed, regret and longing had eaten away at her, until she'd finally decided to try and find the child she'd let go. Zeke's emotions vacillated wildly as he tried to come to terms with this new reality. Part of him was furious. Where had she been all these years? Why now when he'd finally found a place where he belonged? Another part of him was curious, desperate to know more about his origins, to understand the circumstances that had led to his abandonment. Through it all, Callum remained a steady presence, never pushing but always available if Zeke needed to talk. The cousins too rallied around him, providing distraction and support in equal measure. It was Tyler who finally broke through Zeke's conflicted haze, cornering him one afternoon as they tossed a football back and forth in the park near Callum's apartment. "You know you don't have to meet her if you don't want to, right?" Tyler said, lobbing the ball in a perfect spiral. "Uncle Cal says it's completely up to you." Zeke caught the ball, turning it over in his hands as he considered Tyler's words. "I know," he replied slowly, "but I think I need to, if only to get some answers." Tyler nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Well, whatever you decide, we've got your back, you know that, right?" A lump formed in Zeke's throat as he nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know." The meeting was arranged for a sunny Saturday afternoon at a neutral location, a quiet cafe in one of Elmsbrook's many parks. As Zeke approached, Callum by his side, he felt his heart racing, his palms slick with nervous sweat. And then he saw her. Clara Holloway was a petite woman with honey blonde hair and eyes the exact same shade of hazel as Zeke's own. As their gazes met, Zeke felt a jolt of recognition, not memory exactly, but something deeper, more primal. "Zeke," she breathed, rising from her seat. "Oh my God, look at you, you're so grown up." Zeke stood frozen, a maelstrom of emotions swirling within him. It was Callum's gentle hand on his shoulder that finally propelled him forward. The next hour passed in a blur of explanations, tears, and tentative questions. Clara spoke of her own troubled childhood, of the boyfriend who'd abandoned her when she'd gotten pregnant, of the gut-wrenching decision to give up her baby in hopes of giving him a better life. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I never imagined. I'm so sorry, Zeke. If I'd known what you'd go through, I never would have let you go." Zeke listened, feeling strangely detached, as if he were watching the scene unfold from a great distance. It wasn't until Clara reached out, her hand hovering uncertainly over his, that the reality of the situation came crashing down on him. "I know I have no right to ask this," she said softly, "but I was hoping maybe we could try to build some kind of relationship. I've missed out on so much of your life. I'd like the chance to make up for lost time." Zeke's gaze flickered to Callum, who had remained a silent, supportive presence throughout the encounter. The man who had taken him in, who had shown him what it meant to be part of a family, met his eyes with a look of unconditional love and support. In that moment, Zeke knew with crystal clarity what he needed to do. Taking a deep breath, he turned back to Clara. "I appreciate you reaching out," he began, his voice steady despite the tumult of emotions roiling within him. "And I'm glad to finally know the truth about where I came from, but the thing is, I already have a family." Clara's face fell, but Zeke pressed on. "Callum, he's my dad, in every way that matters. And I have cousins now, and an aunt and uncle I haven't even met yet, but who've accepted me without question. I'm not saying I never want to see you again, but I can't just abandon the life I've built, the people who've stood by me through everything." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes, but she nodded, a sad smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I understand," she said softly, "and I'm glad. I'm glad you found people who love you the way you deserve to be loved. That's all I ever wanted for you." As they said their goodbyes, Zeke felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He'd faced his past, confronted the demons that had haunted him for so long, and come out stronger on the other side. The drive home was silent, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken understanding. As they pulled into the parking garage beneath Callum's building, Zeke turned to the man who had become his father in every sense of the word. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Callum's eyes glistened as he pulled Zeke into a fierce hug. "You never have to thank me, son," he murmured. "You're the one who's given me the greatest gift of all, the chance to be a father." When they finally made their way up to the penthouse, they found Tyler, Mia, and Rosie waiting anxiously in the living room. The moment Zeke stepped through the door, he was engulfed in a group hug, the cousins peppering him with questions and words of support. As they all settled onto the plush sofas, Zeke recounted the meeting with Clara, his voice steady as he explained his decision to maintain his current family ties. "Are you sure that's what you want?" Mia asked gently, her brow furrowed with concern. Zeke nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I am," he said. "For the first time in my life, I know exactly where I belong." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of laughter, storytelling, and impromptu dance parties, courtesy of Rosie's unstoppable energy. As Zeke looked around at the faces of his family, because that's truly what they were now, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The next few weeks flew by, a whirlwind of summer activities and preparations for the cousins' departure. Zeke threw himself into making every moment count, determined to create memories that would last until their next visit. On their final night together, Callum surprised everyone with a sunset cruise on Lake Crystalline. As they stood on the deck of the small yacht, watching the sky transform into a canvas of vibrant oranges and pinks, Zeke felt a tugging on his sleeve. He looked down to find Rosie gazing up at him, her green eyes wide and serious. "Zeke," she asked, "you're not going to forget about us when we go home, are you?" Zeke knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the little girl. "Not a chance, Rosie Posey," he said, using the nickname he'd heard Callum use so often. "You guys are stuck with me now, whether you like it or not." Rosie's face split into a wide grin as she threw her arms around his neck. "Good," she declared, "because you're the best big cousin ever." As Zeke hugged her back, he caught sight of Callum watching them, a look of pure joy on his face. In that moment, surrounded by the family he'd found against all odds, Zeke knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the strength and love of those who truly cared for him. The next morning, as they said their goodbyes at the airport, there were tears and promises to stay in touch. Tyler pulled Zeke into a bear hug, whispering, "Take care of yourself, bro. And take care of Uncle Cal, too." Mia was next, her her usually composed demeanor cracking as she hugged Zeke tightly. "Don't be a stranger, okay?" she said. "I expect regular updates on your culinary adventures." As the cousins disappeared through the security checkpoint, Callum wrapped an arm around Zeke's shoulders. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked softly. Zeke nodded, wiping away a stray tear. "Yeah," he said, "I'm gonna miss them, but it's nice knowing they'll be back, that this isn't goodbye. Just see you later." Callum smiled, giving Zeke's shoulder a squeeze. "That's right. And you know, I was thinking, maybe for Christmas we could all go visit them in Oak Ridge. What do you say?" Zeke's face lit up at the prospect. "Really? That would be amazing." As they walked out of the airport and into the bright summer morning, Zeke felt a sense of anticipation for the future, a feeling he'd never truly experienced before. He had a family now, a home, and a world of possibilities stretching out before him. The boy who had once begged for scraps outside Chateau Lumiere was gone, replaced by a young man with hope in his heart and love in his life. As they drove back towards the city, Zeke found himself looking forward to whatever adventures lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that he would face them not alone, but surrounded by the warmth and support of his newfound family. And so, as summer faded into autumn, Zeke Holloway began the next chapter of his life, not as an orphan or a street kid, but as a beloved son, cousin, and friend. The road ahead might not always be easy, but with the love and support of his family, Zeke knew he could face anything that came his way. As they pulled up to Chateau Lumiere, where Callum had some business to attend to, Zeke felt a surge of gratitude wash over him. This restaurant, once a symbol of everything he couldn't have, had become the catalyst for the greatest change in his life. And as he stepped through those gilded doors, no longer a beggar but a member of the Blackwood family, Zeke silently vowed to pay forward the kindness and compassion that had transformed his life. For in the end, that was the true legacy of Callum Blackwood and the family that had welcomed Zeke with open arms. A legacy of love, second chances, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. And as Zeke followed Callum into the bustling kitchen, ready to start another day of learning and growing, he knew that this was just the beginning of a beautiful journey. The story of Zeke Holloway, once a lonely orphan on the streets of Elmsbrook, had transformed into a tale of hope, redemption, and the power of unconditional love. And though challenges would undoubtedly lie ahead, Zeke faced the future with a heart full of gratitude and a spirit strengthened by the unwavering support of his family. As the sounds and smells of Chateau Lumiere enveloped him, Zeke smiled to himself. He was home, he was loved, and he was ready for whatever life had in store for him next. The journey from streets to family was complete, but in many ways, Zeke's adventure was just beginning.